This is the story of Southern Airways Flight 242. On the 4th of April 1977, a Southern Airways DC-9 was on the way from Northwest Alabama Regional Airport to Hartsfield Atlanta International Airport with a stopover in Huntsville, Madison County. Flight 242 made it to Huntsville with no issues whatsoever and landed at about 3:44 p.m. The hop on over to Atlanta would be a short and simple one, taking just 25 minutes. The pilots of Flight 242 had to fly towards the Rome VOR, and then they just had to make their way to runway 26 of Atlanta. The 85 people on board expected a quick flight. They should be on the ground in no time at all. With all of the departure information sorted out, the pilots of Flight 242 took the DC-9 into the skies of Alabama. Once in the air, the pilots were in contact with departure control. They cleared the pilots to take the plane up to 17,000 feet and then make a beeline for the Rome VOR. But things wouldn't be as simple as going in a straight line. The controllers and the plane's weather radar had some bad news for the pilots. The controllers let the pilots know that they had some heavy precipitation in their way at a range of about 5 miles. Looking at the weather radar, the captain remarked, "Well, the radar's full of it. Take your pick." The captain then responded to the controllers by saying, "Okay, so we're in the rain right now, and it doesn't look much heavier than what we're in right now, does it?" The controller said that according to his instruments, the rain would get a bit worse as they went into the cloud mass. The first officer was now looking at the weather radar, trying to make sense of what he was seeing on radar. He said, "I can't read that, it just looks like rain, Bill. What do you think? There's a hole." The first officer might have found their ticket out of the storm system, a break in the weather. They were quite close to it and they should be able to push through riding out the storm. The captain agreed. "There's a hole right there, that's all I see. Then coming over, we had pretty good radar. I believe right straight ahead. There, the next few miles about the best way to go." So the pilots of Flight 242 were going to thread the needle being a massive weather system that had boxed them in from all sides. The controller then came on, and he did not have good news for the pilots of Flight 242. He said, "You're in what appears to be the heaviest part of it now. What are your flight conditions?" The captain replied with, "We're getting a little light turbulence. I'd say moderate rain." With that, Flight 242 was handed off to Memphis Center. Then the captain turned to the first officer and said, "As long as it doesn't get any heavier, we'll be all right." The first officer just said, "Yeah, this is good." At 3:58 p.m., Memphis Control informed the pilots about a SIGMET that was active in the vicinity for Tennessee, southeastern Louisiana, Mississippi North, and western Alabama. For those of you that don't know, a SIGMET stands for a significant meteorological information, and it's only sent out when things are relatively bad, like tornadoes, thunderstorms, extreme hail, turbulence. You get the idea. If there's some sort of weather phenomenon out there that could impinge on the safety of a flight, a SIGMET was sent out, and these guys were in the middle of one. As the plane was put into contact with Atlanta Center, the jet was rocked by some heavy turbulence. The captain explained, "Here we go, hold 'em, cowboy." As the pilots talked to the controllers about how to get the plane on the ground, other planes in the air, like TWA Flight 584, were being rerouted. In the cockpit, the sound of the rain intensified. As the rain picked up, the pilots slowed down. They were now engrossed in their weather radar. They were in a weather maze and they had to find a way out. The captain did not like what he saw. He said, "Looks heavy, nothing's getting through that." The first officer looked for another way out. He said, "That's a hole, isn't it?" Then they decided to hand fly the jet through the hole at a speed of about 285 knots. As all of this was happening, Atlanta Control was trying to get other planes through the weather. As the TWA jet punched through the weather, the sound of the rain intensified even more in the cockpit. Then, from the perspective of the controllers, the plane went dark. They tried reaching the jet, but no response was received. The controllers kept trying to raise Flight 242. They said, "Southern 242 Atlanta. Southern 242 Atlanta." I imagine they thought that something bad had happened to Flight 242, and I think that they were getting a little bit scared. Then Flight 242 was back with them, but something was seriously wrong though. The first thing that the crew told Atlanta Center was to stand by, and the controllers asked the pilots to maintain 15,000 feet if they were able to, and the pilots just said, "We're trying to get it up there." Then, a few seconds later, the pilots were able to clue the controllers in on what was happening. The first officer just said, "Left engine won't spool, our left engine just cut out." Flight 242 was in some of the worst weather, and they had just lost an engine. This was dangerous. In the cockpits, the pilots were dealing with the emergency. "Autopilot off," said the captain. "I got this, I'll hand fly it," replied the first officer. Then came the gut punch that they hoped wouldn't come. The first officer turned to the captain and said, "The other engine's going too." The first officer got on the radio to let the controllers know what was happening. The first officer radioed, "The other engine is going too." The controllers were like, "Say again?" The first officer just said, "Stand by, we lost both engines." Things were now serious. The captain just said, "Get us a vector to a clear area, Atlanta." The controllers knew that TWA Flight 584 was in an area with decent weather, so they routed the plane in that direction. In the cockpit, the pilots were trying their best to get the engines up and running. The pilot transmitted, "All right, we've lost both engines, and I can't tell you the implications. Listen, we only got 2 engines. How far away is Dobbins now?" The pilots were aiming to get the jet into Dobbins Air Base Reserve. The pilots were familiar with it, and it was about 20 miles away. So it was theoretically possible for the jet to glide there. As the pilots were focused on not stalling the plane, they made their way towards Dobbins. The pilots inquired about the weather at Dobbins. If the weather at Dobbins was too bad, then this landing would be made much more difficult. But after a while, getting to Dobbins seemed like an impossibility. The airport was 17 miles away and the jet was only at 4,600 feet. The pilots knew that they were in a tough situation. The pilots, out of desperation, asked the controllers if there was an airport between them and Dobbins. But there were no airports. The captain said, "I doubt we're going to make it, but we're trying to get something started." And then a ray of hope for the pilots. The controllers proposed that the pilots could divert to Cartersville, which was 10 miles to the south and 15 miles west of Dobbins. The pilots took it. They asked for a clear heading to Cartersville and asked for the runway length. But then they quickly realized that the airport was just too far away for them to make it. The captain turned to the first officer and said, "I'm picking out a clear field." They were going to put this jet down where no one would be hurt. The first officer didn't really like that idea. He replied with, "Bill, you've got to find me a highway." The captain was hesitant with the idea of turning a highway into a runway, but it had to be done. The first officer saw what he had been looking for. He said, "Right there, is that straight?" The captain just replied with "No," and the first officer said, "We'll have to take it." At this point, the controllers finally got back to the pilots with the runway configuration for Cartersville. But the pilots had made up their mind. They said, "We're putting it down on the highway. We're down to nothing." End quote. The huge jet lined up with the highway and the jet lost speed. They brought the jet closer and closer to the highway. The left wing of the jet clipped 2 trees on State Spur Highway 92 right side of a small town called New Hope. This didn't bring the jet down. It went on for another 0.8 miles before the left wing hit another tree, this time in the town of New Hope. As the wings went through the trees and utility poles, the main landing gear touched down on the runway. Then the left wing hit an embankment, and that sent the plane off the highway and into the community of New Hope. The jet flew through road signs, utility poles, fences, trees, shrubs, gasoline pumps at a gas station, 5 automobiles, and a truck. The total wreckage area was about 1,900 feet long and 295 feet wide. The passenger jet had carved out a swath of devastation throughout the community of New Hope. Of the 85 people on board, 63 people did not make it, and 9 people on the ground had perished in the crash. Everyone now wanted answers. How did a passenger jet just lose power and then fall into a sleepy little community? Their first clue came from the passengers on board, one of whom was a licensed pilot. All the survivors had the same thing to say. The flight was mostly flown in rain, but then they hit some turbulence and then the plane was engulfed in rain and hail, and that's when the engines just died. Passenger jets are designed to withstand insane amounts of rain. When they're testing engines, they'll basically take a giant shower head and chuck insane amounts of water into the engine just to see if it fails. So, could rain have taken down Flight 242? Only the wreck held those secrets. Now, you'd think that in this case there was just too much rain to the point where water just drowned out the engines, but that's not the case. You see, the plane lost electrical power for a few seconds before the engines cut out. That gives us a clue. The electrical power only cuts out if the engine spins slow enough that they fall below the generator threshold, and the investigators think that the rail and hail was so intense that it physically slowed the engines down to below this threshold. In addition to that, this major bout of rain and hail coincided with when the pilots were pulling back power on the engines from the descent from 17,000 feet. Bad timing, what can I say? What's more is that the test showed that the engine would lose a significant amount of rotational energy if the water-to-air ratio was greater than 14. This first bout of rain and hail didn't take the engines out. They surged and stalled, but that would only happen if there was combustion in the engines. So this surge brought the engines to its knees, but it didn't take them out. These surges then played a crucial role in destroying the engines of Flight 242. The surges would be in the aft sections of the high-pressure turbines, and this would create a high-pressure region in the low-pressure region of the engines. And those overpressures were strong enough to bend the vanes in the low-pressure turbines of the engine, causing catastrophic damage to the engines. What's more is the pilots pushed the engines forward when they saw the rotation of the engine dropping. This was a natural reaction to seeing your rotational speeds drop. But this came at such a bad time, as the increase in power caused even more damage to the engine, as it caused the damaged bits of the engine to rub up against each other, causing even more damage to the engine. It's an unfortunate fact that no amount of troubleshooting would have allowed them to restart their engines, as they were just too far gone. But here's a more important question. Why was the plane in the weather system in the first place? I mean, you're supposed to head away from storms, deviate around it, or do something, not be in the middle of it. What's interesting is that what the pilots received were weather prediction about phenomena that could happen in an area. They were given very little information on what the actual conditions were. The main problem was that neither the pilots nor dispatch asked about the weather. As the plane left Huntsville, there were reports coming in from Rome that said that there were thunderstorms to the southeast and southwest of Rome, and as the jet flew towards Rome, they couldn't see anything out the window because they were in IFR conditions. So they were relying on the weather radar a lot. Here's the thing about radar. It works using reflected radio waves. Remember how the pilot saw a hole in the weather and then they were trying to get the plane to go through that hole so that they could break through the weather? Well, unfortunately, that wasn't a break in the weather. In fact, it was the worst of it. You see, the rain was so strong in that area that the rain weakened the returning radio waves that the radar system used. So the plane's computer was like, oh, the radio waves coming from that side are quite low, so that must mean that there's less rain there. But in this case, it was the exact opposite. Due to this error, the pilot steered the plane into the worst of the weather. With that, the fate of the airplane was sealed, and they were headed into the eye of the storm, literally. There was nothing that they could do to save the plane after the engines had flamed out. They were on their own. They were in clouds, they really didn't know where the airports were, and they were too far away, and the ones that were closer to them they could not get to. It was just a real mess of a situation. What do you think of their decision to put the plane down on a highway and not a field? Do you agree with that? Who knows, maybe the highway was the only option. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.